You poured a glass of water this morning and drank it in maybe 4 seconds. What you didn't know is that some of what slid down your throat may have fallen from the sky before the first tree ever grew on this planet. Not before recorded history, before forests, before anything with a spine had crawled out of the sea. We treat the water from the tap as the most disposable thing in the house, cheaper than the cup it sits in, summoned with a flick of the wrist, poured down the drain by the gallon without a single thought. But the substance arriving at your faucet is not fresh, and it is not simple. In many places, it is among the oldest things you will ever touch. The machine that delivers it is one of the largest structures the human species has ever assembled, so vast, so deep, and so quietly overstrained that most people spend an entire lifetime standing on top of it without once feeling its weight. And the way we are pulling water out of the ground is doing something underneath us that cannot be undone. Something already cracking open the surface of one of the most productive landscapes in America. Deep in the rock under Minnesota sits water that has been waiting in the dark for somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years. It soaked underground while mammoths still crossed North America and the last ice age still gripped the continent, and it has not moved or seen sunlight since. A modern well can punch a steel pipe straight down into that frozen pocket of time and haul it to the surface in a single afternoon. 50,000 years of stillness ended in the minutes it takes to fill a tank. That isn't even the extreme edge. Deep inside a Canadian mine, beneath the Canadian Shield, some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth, researchers tapped into water that had been sealed away from the world for more than 1.2 billion years. It is among the oldest water ever found anywhere. Older than fish, older than insects, older than the first creature that ever drew breath on dry land. When that water last touched open air, the continents themselves had not yet drifted into the shapes on our maps. Groundwater is not a delivery system. It is storage. It is rain and snowmelt that sank down through soil and stone and then simply stopped, caught in the pores and fractures of rock like water wrung into a sponge that never gets squeezed. Sometimes for a few decades, sometimes for entire geological eras. Every aquifer is a savings account written in centuries. And the instant you begin withdrawing faster than the sky pays back in, you start moving toward a threshold that does not reset once it's crossed. The water has been keeping records the entire time it sat down there, and one of those records is a scar left by the 20th century. Through the 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union spent the better part of a decade detonating nuclear weapons in the open air. Each blast threw a radioactive form of hydrogen, called tritium, high into the atmosphere. It drifted down across the entire planet, dissolved into the surface water everywhere on Earth, and sank into the ground with the next rain. Hydrologists now read that as a fingerprint. If the water from a well carries the tritium spike, it fell after the bombs. If it doesn't, it is older than the Cold War itself. The water in your pipes is, in a real sense, stamped with the date of the atomic age. Tritium is only one of the buried clocks. Carbon trapped in the water can push the dating back 30,000 years. A rare form of krypton can read groundwater more than 1 million years old. And dissolved in that same water are noble gases, argon, xenon, that drifted in from the atmosphere at the precise moment the rain first formed. They dissolve at rates that depend on temperature. Cold water captures more, warm water less. Measure exactly how much is locked inside, and you can calculate how cold the air was on the day that water fell, tens of thousands of years before any human stood beneath that sky. The water remembers the weather of a world we never saw, all of which quietly detonates a phrase you have been sold your entire life. Pure mountain spring water. The words conjure something pristine, untouched, clean to its core. The truth runs the other way. Water that is genuinely ancient, water that has spent 1,000 years pressed against rock, has spent that whole millennium dissolving the rock. It pulls out whatever the stone is built from. Sometimes that's lithium, the same element prescribed to steady human moods. Sometimes it's iron and manganese that turn it metallic and stain everything they touch. Sometimes it's salt, climbing until the water is too briny to swallow. And sometimes it's naturally radioactive material, leached straight out of the surrounding minerals into water you'd pour for a child. The genuinely clean-tasting water, that clear, cold gush off a mountainside, is often the youngest water there is. Snowmelt only a few months old that has barely touched anything at all. The complicated mineral-heavy water is the old water. Purity and age were never the same property. You were simply never told which of the two was in your glass. Most of the water filling the reservoirs of the largest cities on Earth was never sitting conveniently below them. It started somewhere far away, and the engineering built to drag it across the landscape ranks among the most extreme construction ever attempted, almost all of it hidden underground where no one will ever lay eyes on it. Beneath the state of New York runs a passage almost no living person has seen. It is 85 miles long, a single unbroken bore through solid bedrock, the longest tunnel of any kind anywhere on the planet. Crews sank 31 separate shafts into the earth to attack it from many points at once, then carved inward with drills and dynamite, hollowing out a tube wide enough to park a school bus inside. In places it runs 2,500 feet below the surface, deeper than 8 statues of liberty stacked nose to base and driven straight down into the ground. It plunges beneath the Hudson River through an inverted siphon cut 600 feet under the riverbed, then climbs the far bank and keeps going. The water that fills it begins life in the Catskill Mountains, in a watershed so wild it still shelters black bears, beavers, bald eagles, and more than 60 species of fish. The forest itself does the cleaning, which is the only reason the city can get away with what it does next. Through that tunnel surges roughly 600 million gallons of water every single day. And this is the detail that stops engineers mid-sentence. Nothing pushes it. There is no pump driving the main flow. The entire underground river that keeps 9 million people alive is carried the whole distance by gravity alone. The patient, unrelenting pull on water sliding down a slope so gentle your eye could never detect it, creeping forward through total darkness, mile after mile after mile. They built it through a war. Construction pressed straight through World War II. The tunnel sunk so far beneath the earth that no bomb of the era could reach it, and the work sites guarded against sabotage, on the cold logic that an enemy who cut or poisoned a city's water could cripple it without firing a shot. Then it simply ran without stopping, for more than 80 years, until a single planned shutdown in 2024, the first time the tunnel had gone dark since the days of black and white film. Engineers approached that shutdown the way surgeons approach an operation, timing it for October when demand drops, pre-filling backup reservoirs, wiring in a switch so they could restore the flow within days if a drought turned dangerous. And the millions drinking from it have, almost without exception, never once pictured the 85-mile river sliding beneath their feet, or grasped that their water arrives so clean the city never bothers to filter it at all, one of only 5 major American cities that doesn't. Gravity is a gift when the source sits high in the mountains and the city waits below it. It is an enemy when the water sits in a valley and the city is stranded on the wrong side of a mountain range. In California, the water is forced to climb. The state's main water project hoists water 2,000 feet straight up the face of the Tehachapi Mountains north of Los Angeles, lifting an entire river over a wall of rock. The power that demands is almost incomprehensible. Pushing water up that single mountain range is the largest single use of electricity in the entire state of California. Not a steel mill, not a data center, not the city of Los Angeles itself, forcing water uphill. And that is one climb among several. Farther east, the Colorado River Aqueduct drags water out of Lake Havasu and lifts it through a chain of 5 separate pumping plants, each one a fortress of machinery shoving the river higher, 291 feet at the first, 300 at the next, hundreds more at every plant beyond, until the water has been lifted 1,600 feet in total, only then released to coast downhill across the Mojave Desert toward the coast. That one aqueduct burns through roughly 2 million megawatt hours every year, more electricity than entire towns consume, purely to move water against gravity. The splash you'd use to rinse a single plate in Los Angeles may have been hauled across a desert and heaved over a mountain range by pumps the size of buildings, devouring more power on the trip than a small city uses in a year. After all of that, the buried ancient store, the 85-mile tunnels, the rivers dragged over mountains, you would assume the difficult part is getting the water to the house. It isn't. The slowest, strangest stretch of the entire journey begins after the water reaches you. Engineers track a number they call water age, how long the water has been sitting somewhere in the system since it left the treatment plant. Across the country, it averages about a day and a third. In some corners of the network, it stretches to 17 days. And the worst offender is frequently the last few feet of pipe, the plumbing sealed inside your own walls. The cold water that runs first thing in the morning has stood motionless in those pipes all night, aging in place, traveling nowhere while its clock keeps ticking. It rots fastest at the dead ends. In the looping pipes that serve a cul-de-sac or the houses at the frayed edge of a network, the water has nowhere to flow and simply sits. And it sits longest when a family locks up and leaves for vacation, drawing nothing at all for a week. Utilities know precisely where these stagnant pockets form. They send crews out to run deliberate flushing programs, cracking open hydrants to dump thousands of gallons of perfectly good water into the gutter for one reason only: to haul the old dead water out of those dead-end pipes before it turns on the people at the end of the line. During the pandemic, when office towers stood empty for months and no one ran the taps, the water inside those buildings aged so far that the count of living microbes in it climbed by more than tenfold. Why does standing water turn at all? Because the pipe it stands in is not the sterile metal tube you picture. It is alive. More than 90% of the living organisms in a drinking water system aren't drifting in the water. They are fused to the inner walls of the pipes in a slick, stubborn layer called a biofilm. It's a microscopic city of bacteria cemented to the metal, sheltered from the current racing past and from the chemicals engineered to wipe them out. Every glass you have ever poured flowed through a living tunnel, its walls coated in colonies that have held that ground for years. The only thing keeping them subdued is a chemical leash, and the leash is always loosening. Tap water is disinfected, not sterilized. Treatment plants dose it with chlorine or chloramine to hold the microbes down. But that protection decays with every hour and every mile the water travels onward. So, the household sitting close to the plant receives water with its chemical guard still strong, while the household at the far end of the same system, identical utility, identical source, receives water that is older, weaker, and carrying noticeably more bacterial growth. Two homes on the same street can be drinking measurably different water, and the only thing separating them is distance from the plant. In the hidden geometry of the water system, how far you live from the source is a quiet inequality that appears on no map and no bill. And then, there's the question of where the water had been before the treatment plant ever got hold of it. The question almost no one wants to ask out loud. At this moment today, millions of people are drinking water that was very recently sewage, not in some grim hypothetical future, now. It happens two ways: the quiet, near-universal way. A town upstream flushes its toilets, treats the wastewater, and releases it into a river. And the next town downstream draws its drinking water out of the very same river, treats it again, and serves it from the tap. The water in your glass may have moved through a stranger's body 100 miles upstream a week ago. Engineers even have a bloodless term for it: de facto reuse. You were simply never standing at the right bend in the river to notice the handoff. The deliberate version is more advanced and far more honest about itself. Big Spring, Texas treats wastewater directly back into drinking water on purpose. The capital of Namibia, Windhoek, has been doing exactly that since 1968, meaning the true pioneer of drinking recycled sewage was not some recent tech venture, but a desert city that ran out of other options more than half a century ago. The science has worked for decades. The obstacle was never the engineering. It was the human gag reflex. In the year 2000, Los Angeles finished a $55 million plant built to recycle water. And a candidate running for mayor turned it into a weapon with 4 words: never drink toilet water. The line landed, the plant was shuttered within days. $55 million of functioning infrastructure killed not by any failure in the science, but by a single sentence. Even though the recycled water would have been spread across the entire city, the mayor's own neighborhood included. Which brings us back down into the rock and to the threshold that does not reset. Here is what actually happens when you pull water out of an ancient aquifer faster than 100,000 years of rain could ever refill it. That deep water is not pooled in open underground caverns. It is wedged into the microscopic gaps between grains of sand and sediment and rock. And while it sits there under pressure, it is doing a job. It is holding the ground up. The water itself is part of the skeleton, propping the layers of earth above it apart. Draw that water out, and the spaces it was bracing open begin to cave in. the sediment compacts, the pores flatten and seal, and the moment they collapse, something permanent is done. That space is gone for good. It can never hold as much water again. You haven't merely drained the tank, you've crushed it flat. Even if every drop that ever fell came pouring back over the next 10,000 years, the aquifer could never be refilled to what it once held because the container itself has been compressed into something smaller and denser forever. In California's Central Valley, the ground that grows a huge share of the food on American tables, this is not a warning about the future, it's happening now. So much ancient water has been hauled up from beneath the farmland that the surface of the earth is sinking, buckling, fracturing, dropping in elevation as the hollowed-out ground caves in beneath the fields. In the worst-hit stretches, the land has fallen by tens of feet. Roads warp. Canals built to run downhill stop running. The water being pumped to the surface would take thousands of years to replace, and the empty space it leaves is sealing shut behind it as it goes. So the next time you turn the handle and fill a glass without a thought, hold it a second longer and consider what's actually in your hand. Water that may be older than your entire species. Water hauled over mountains by pumps that outdraw cities, or dropped through 85 miles of solid bedrock beneath a sleeping metropolis. Water that flowed through a living tunnel, kept barely in check by a chemical leash, already going slack. Water drawn from a buried vault that, in some places, is quietly collapsing shut behind it. One ordinary, unremarkable glass at a time.